You. We will now be moving on to the panel portion of the session. The panel will be moderated by Angie Zhou. Angie is a PhD candidate in political economy at MIT. She holds a master's degree in city planning from MIT, and her thesis work on new cities was published in Towards Urban Economic Vibrancy, Patterns and Practices in Asia's New Cities through the MIT Sustainable Urbanization Lab.
Hello? Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to the presenters for this really thought-provoking afternoon session. So I'll start off with a couple of questions, and then if we have time, I'll try to open it up to the audience since we haven't had audience questions yet. So I think actually I'll start with Professor Du. One question I had is that, going back to Astrid's point earlier, a lot of the contexts in the global south where new cities are being proposed are places where, on paper you have these beautiful institutions for democracy, upholding free market activity, but then in practice, it doesn't happen. And so the argument for a new city is to have this kind of institutional oasis or a special economic zone where it will happen. And then people actually point to Shenzhen as like, see, it happened there. But it sounds like your story of Shenzhen is saying, historically, that maybe isn't the correct interpretation of what happened. That actually, in China's case, it was a failed national communist experiment, and then they were like, let's relieve the pressure in one place and allow free market activity to happen here. So do you see the analogy that Shenzhen presents as accurate for a lot of these arguments for new cities today in the global south?
Thank you for that question. It's a difficult question for a few reasons. One is that it's very dangerous to think of Shenzhen as a model, because when Shenzhen was created in 1979, it was extraordinary circumstances that created, and so both national politics of China and geopolitics. So prior to 1979, China was an isolated country, and I would say, it was from, say, 1949 to 1979. There's 50 years the communist rule. There were private ownership prior to, centuries prior. So meaning it was at the heel of a 50-year communist planned economy. So there was so much pent-up economic pressure and also human psychology, meaning for 50 years, wherever you are in China, you're born and you take the job of your father or your mother. You're told where to live, what to study, and it's like from you're born till you die, your map is outlined for you. And from another perspective, it's a communist utopia, right? Everyone had a job, everyone had housing. But what happened in Shenzhen in 1979, and Ellen was talking about what attracts people to go. From my research, it was an opportunity to be who you want to be. So it was something much more humanistic. Everyone had a job. That by definition, everyone had a job. So for the first decade, for the most difficult startup phase of Shenzhen, the first decade where there was no water, no electricity, no telephone, no infrastructure, yet people still went there. They went there, I think, for some of the reasons why many people came to New York. It was it was kind of this place where, for lack of a better word, freedom, but it wasn't necessarily political freedom. It was a humanistic freedom. So that was so exceptional that, so I would say that's one of the reasons that's very difficult to say, to kind of make a very broad generalization about Shenzhen. On the other hand, I do think, I do think there's a lot we can learn from this highly exceptional place, such as, right? Actually, a few people already said it, that you need to create cities for all income levels. You need to create cities where everyone could see themselves there, regardless of how old you are, what economic background you have, and what aspirations you might have. And then, at the root of it, getting back to your question about what does that mean for what form of governance, it is a civic governance, right? So whether you want to call it politically a democracy or not, but there is in Shenzhen in the first 2 decades after it became formalized as a city, it definitely had a civic governance where the first couple mayors of Shenzhen were very, very progressive. So 2 examples, I'll say. One is people talk about Shenzhen speed. So the first mayor from the mayor of Shenzhen from 1980 to 1984, he made a rule to say any application for for permit, for license that's written to the mayor's office, if you don't hear back in 15 days, consider it approved. Think about what would happen in New York, right? I'll use that. Another fact, right? But it's not neoliberalism either. People, when I talk about Shenzhen, people are like, oh, you're just proposing. I was like, no. Strong governance is important, such as that same mayor in 1983, Shenzhen made a little bit of money, and he put aside 50% of the surplus that Shenzhen, the city, had at the end. He said, I'm going to, this is still before infrastructure, this is before telecommunication. He said, I'm going to put aside 50% to build a university. So there were kind of, you had steps of how to make a city, somewhere in there. Maybe step 1.1, education. So this is a mayor who put 50% of the funding they have into a university. This is when Shenzhen was still just religious. This is when Alan was like, there's no future here. and he put aside this money to say, we're going to build a university, because he recognized what Shenzhen needed the most to make into a successful city. And he said, I need talent. I don't need money. I do, but I need talent even more. So he's talking about kind of educated talent, people who's willing to do there, to be there. So it's very difficult because a different mayor could have made different decisions. But I would tell you about that investment. He invested into Shenzhen University. Has anyone heard of Tencent? Tencent is the world's largest multimedia, gaming, telecommunication, 80% of the global market. He's a graduate of Shenzhen University. So he's the first generation graduate of Shenzhen University. His parents moved from Beijing to Shenzhen. He was born in Shenzhen. He basically, that return, thousands of folds of that. So just to say that I think it's a complex issue, but absolutely a clear form of civic governance with accountability, I actually think is what makes Shenzhen, what allows Shenzhen to be successful. And it is the contrary of, a very heavy-handed top-down. It's messy, it's not perfect, but it's still, from my research, is what makes Shenzhen work. And very often, I do get anxious because very often when Shenzhen is cited as a model, it's citing Shenzhen as the opposite of that, of a very kind of heavily controlled, top-down control of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because even when I was in Shenzhen, the young people there, even today, they're saying this is the only city in China, maybe, that people dress like this, that people speak like this. Everyone's from a different place. There's a kind of larger vision of what the city is. That's not just, all of the major tech firms are located here. And so I was, related to that, I was going to ask. Okay, yes, please.
Piketty, my compatriot, started a fashion of quoting novels to support macroeconomics. And I think that in the case of Shenzhen, I read a book, it's a novel, but certainly autobiographic, which is Northern Girls. Have you read it? So that gives you the inside story of somebody moving to Shenzhen and how tough it was, but this motivation, living your own life. And I think that I strongly recommend, after Piketty, to add the reference to novels when we talk about economics. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, so Alain, I was also going to ask you then, when you say, people don't move to a city because it has the best sewage system, people don't also only move to a city because it has, it's biotech city or AI city or these sort of advertised sectors. They have to have some other pull factor. So could you elaborate a little bit on what you think
Yes.
would help?
For instance, the environment is important, of course. I remember, again, we're always talking about China. In Sichuan, a city which wanted to expand, and it was a city of 800,000, about that, which for China is a small city. And they had an industry which was flat screen industry. They wanted to expand it, but they could not recruit the engineers to move to this relatively small city of Sichuan. And the mayor, instead of trying to subsidize the industry, as we would have done here probably, the mayor would have done, he went to Shanghai, he went to the port, the eastern coast of China, where the engineers were, and asked them what it will take for you to move to a city like mine. And the engineers say, we want very good schools for our children, and we want clean environment, clean air, and a pleasant environment. That was the two things they asked. The mayor immediately came back to his city. The city was along two rivers, converging, and they were kind of muddy banks. He immediately transformed that into linear parks along the river. He put a little marina so you could have rowboat and sailboat. And then he started recruiting school teachers and paying them much more than other ports. Within a few years, he had all the engineers he wanted. So you see, again, the migration it depends, of course, where you are. If you are in a very poor country, if you are in Bangladesh, probably jobs is the only thing you want. But for other people, it would be university or research or something like that. But it could be environment. My son, when he graduated from the University of Maryland and he was looking for a job, he had a map of wind frequency and strengths all over the United States, and he moved to San Francisco because for windsurfing he thought it was the best place. Fortunately, it was a city which he found a job.
Great. And so for Patrick, I was wondering, you're really approaching the context where you work from the perspective of providing public goods in places where the demand for expansion is already there, the migrant workforce is there, the people are there, they're building, they're moving in. So how do you do this in a more proactive manner? But I was wondering whether the issue of guiding economic development and what jobs the migrants and informal workers take, whether that's also part of that. So not just providing public goods, but also some of the pull factors as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think governments try to do that. They do try to do that. They definitely try to identify growth industries and core providers of employment that, in a way, almost provide the export product of the city. Maybe not literally an export, but it's the thing that they can sell to other people. When you look at the numbers on that, it's rarely more than 10 to 15% of the workforce employed in those core industries. This is like, we're working with Michael Adams at the back there, who's found some great numbers on that. And so I think that can be an important part of the development process. But in a way, in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Central Asia, the population pressure is strong enough that that I don't think that that's the most important thing for governments to do right now. And especially to some of the earlier speakers' points, where the national conditions don't really enable the development of strong sectors that can go beyond the borders. Often these ideas like, let's make biotech city, or let's make a cyber city or an AI city. These just end up being huge wastes of money. And so I tend to think like there's a hierarchy of priorities. We had this great example, and I don't want to talk it too great a length on it, but we had this great example of a city we worked in Ethiopia called Bahir Dar. And Ethiopia was aggressively engaged in the creation of export-focused industrial parks. And this was like a major focus for them of public money. Like they were putting a lot of public money into creating export-focused industrial parks. And Bahir Dar had one. And they also had an urban expansion plan that essentially framed out land on the periphery of the city. And what ended up happening ultimately was a portion of this land that was set aside for the urban expansion plan developed into a local industry park that actually facilitated more jobs and created more opportunities for the people in that city than the export-focused industry park, and at almost no cost to the government, and with essentially no premeditation. All they did was they looked at it and they said, people are moving here, there's a high demand for land, let's try to meet this demand for land and be agnostic about how it's used. And it was a location that was good for an industry cluster. They couldn't have predicted it, and it developed. And so I tend to think that like the challenge of like industrial development, particularly in Africa, is more about removing obstacles than it is about picking winners. And I think that's what my experience has told me. And again, not to go on at too great a length, but if they had decided in Bahir Dar that they wanted to be Bahir Dar Semiconductor City, they would have wasted a ton of money and gotten no jobs. And instead what they said was, we want to try to build something that meets the need that we see, and do it in a way that we can afford. And it worked. To the points about like the things that you need to provide, like you have a city of 100,000, you need a sewage treatment plant and things like that. Everyone deserves to have their waste handled well. Everyone deserves clean drinking water. Everyone deserves paved roads and drainage. But the thing that I've seen is you often get there in steps. And if you're not willing to take the first step because you can't already take the last step, then you end up with massive amounts of informal development where nobody has anything. So like we can't say we can't do anything for these people because we can't give them the same sewage treatment plant that they have in the Netherlands. We have to do something. So that's something, I'm a big proponent of incremental development of infrastructure that pays for itself. Because that way you can give it to everybody instead of just to the people who are able to win loans from the World Bank, or grants.
And one last question for all three of you is, I think one theme that runs through all of your presentations is not seeing pre-existing people, settlements, economic activities as a nuisance, something to, get rid of so that we can clear the land for greenfield, for a blank slate, but actually as an asset maybe, or something that is a comparative advantage, something that should guide the specialization or the direction of the city. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about this really big difference in this, even in this room, between seeing new cities as blank slate greenfield developments, and that's where the advantage lies, versus the way that you seem to see it.
The tabula rasa is intoxicating, and it's also completely ahistorical. I think that the reality is, and several people have spoken about this, is that pre-existing conditions exist. They're there. They're on the ground. The people are there. The owners are there. Sally uses the great example of London and the Christopher Wren plan for London, which after the fire in 1666 sought to kind of rationalize the city of London with a proper urban plan. And anyone who's been to London knows that failed. It didn't happen because even in a place that's been completely destroyed by a fire, pre-existing conditions exist. There are owners, there are rights, there are institutions. And that's the case everywhere. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we let those things be a wind at our back, where we're building in ways that are contextually appropriate and that will actually work with the people that are there and the institutions that are there, or do we try to fight against that and either produce something that's completely sterile, which is what often happens, sterile and costly, or simply fail, which happens a lot as well. So I think that, again, if you take this very hands-off approach, in some way the problem solves itself. The only time that you have an issue with what's there already is if you're trying to control too much. The example of the urban villages is that to a T. You know, you kind of let it be, let it respond, and it becomes an asset because the people who live in those places are smart and they're trying to optimize. And if good things are happening around them, then they will get involved in them one way or another. And the people who are already in a place will solve problems for you that you didn't even know that you had. That's the truth. So I think that it's every development strategy has to have a mix with it. I always think, like, if a big new development project comes to your land, it shouldn't mean that you end up displaced and living somewhere else and broke. It should mean that you end up like these people in Shenzhen. You should end up rich and engaged and doing things that are amazing. You know, that's what it should mean. It should be good news, and that's how you can actually do it. That's how you can actually, like, get past opposition and make it a positive thing.
Well, you know, in my book, it's a chapter on housing. I survey a bit different way where affordable housing have been produced around the world, around in the cities where I worked. And I found, in fact, two examples. And one was Shenzhen, the urban villages of Shenzhen, which provide, you know, affordable housing. And the other is in Surabaya, the Kampong component, you know, which are exactly the same thing, although it's treated completely differently from the Chinese model. But they are villages that Surabaya or Jakarta absorb as they grew, and they give a special status, a bit similar or in a different way to the urban villages. And basically, if you are within the perimeter of this village, you are able to build whatever you want, whatever your income, and the government subsidizes to a certain extent the infrastructure, and that's it. And so you have those areas. So other areas of Surabaya have a traditional zoning, you know, where it's very predictable what will be built. But in the Kampong area, you have this, you know, let's say the standard adjusts automatically to what the people can afford. And within the same Kampong, you see people who are university professors and others who have very low manual labor, you know, low productivity, side by side. It doesn't matter. So these are the two solutions. And again, this by absorbing the existing population, integrating into the urbanization rather than kicking them out.
Thank you. So the quick answer is yes. I think I forgot the original question, but it's about should new cities work with existing conditions, and I would say absolutely. And for me, I don't think it's contradictory. I don't think it's necessarily binary contradiction to say new cities versus existing cities. But if we look at history as a continuum, nothing is ever new. So, for example, I'll use two facts. One is the morning panel, a lot was spoken about infrastructure and connectivity. So using, again, Shenzhen as an example, is that when the earliest 5 years of the city, one of the big challenges is transportation, right? How do you get goods and the concrete and the materials that's into the city to be used? And at the time, there was the Shekou, I don't know if you know, Shekou Industrial Port, industrial zone. And the director of that was very much a very progressive person. So he looked around in Hong Kong, in Shenzhen, he was looking for a port to be able to bring goods and services in, because the land, you know, again, 1970s, 80s China, the road infrastructure was terrible. So he understood just like what is happening, say, the African continent, is that you really need ports to be able to bring things in. but the city had no money, the central government no money. So he looked around, and it's because he was born in Shenzhen, and he remember when he was taught by a village teacher there that during the maritime Silk Road times, this is going back 2,000 years, that there was a deep channel port. So he hired a young PhD student from Beijing University, and they went around just walking all the way along the coastal areas trying to find where was that port, because China went through a lot of famine and war and destruction and all of that. Yeah, it was almost tabula rasa because so much destruction has happened that they didn't even know where it was located, even though they knew something was there, and they found it, and they found it in Shekou, very close to it. And they found this, it's been abandoned for 800 years, but they found that it was still very relatively inexpensive to make it into a port that can allow deep channels in. And that was the first port of Shenzhen. And during the first decade of Shenzhen's construction, 90% of the materials and goods came through this port, this one, before they built another one, a bigger one, and a bigger one. So I would say I don't know if there's any more green fields in the world, frankly, including Antarctica, where there wasn't anyone there, and 100 years ago we discovered it and built research stations there. So I think there's memory and history, geography to any sites that you want to build cities on, and I think it's important to really research in a broader sense of what that is. The other thing about kind of economic infrastructure and investment is I don't think foreign investments and local residents or local communities' involvements, I also don't see these two, it's not either or. I think it's both, and, right? So Alan very helpfully pointed out that I didn't mention the town-village enterprises. Very often people outside of China have no idea what that is. So since you mentioned, town-village enterprises actually existed in China since the 50s. And it was under Mao's time, they were trying to allow villages to build up their own industrial capacity. They can do coal, they can make radios or brooms. So to allow the countryside another channel of economic income in addition to agricultural, which sometimes is not predictable depending on famine, water, etc. So town and village enterprises existed a long time in the countryside. So this is why in Shenzhen, when it became a city, town and enterprises was still a thing. It was still allowed. I think Mark said earlier about how a lot of the funding in Shenzhen came through as foreign direct investments. I always say there's a common. The majority of that went into the town and village enterprises, meaning they did not go in to build the Coca-Colas. They went into individual, like hundreds of thousands little businesses, mom and pop shops. Yes, they were invested from Hong Kong, but because they were their uncles. It was like their aunt, the uncles from Malaysia and Singapore. So it was this kind of transnational kind of blood kinship network, because this territory was for centuries international trading. So there's a lot of, every villager in Shenzhen today and used to be has like an uncle who lives in New York and an aunt who lives in Singapore. So when it was allowed, it was the first, again, it wasn't allowed during communist rule. So in 1979, once it was allowed, yeah, a lot of people sent in. For them, it was like a $5 check. But in China at that time, it was like the equivalent of like a $10,000 investment, right? So the majority were these town village enterprises, and that's during the first 5 to 10 years, which, yes, later decades it became bigger and bigger, but that's also the most difficult time of any company or any city, is that really beginning to really get that started. So if there wasn't this policy, top-down policy that allowed for this, that wouldn't have happened. But also the local network and local history and community, that was equally as important. So for me, a lot of the things that's been discussed today, I don't necessarily see them as binaries. I think we should see how they can work organically together, but also highly sensitive and aware of local conditions and where they are in say their developmental phase. I'm not sure if we can ever arrive at like one formula that fits all.
Just say one very briefly. I know we don't have
I think we have, one last comment maybe.
2 seconds. It's a thread that's running through the day is like the difference between doing something that's basically a real estate project for rich people versus doing something that actually has the potential to evolve and change over time, which is what we really think about when we think about the benefits we want from cities. So I just wanted to throw out there, if you haven't read this book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap by Yuen Ong, you really should. It's great on this topic. Highly recommended.
Do we have time for other questions or moving on? Okay, thank you so much.